You ever burn a $47,000 bill just to see who shows up at your door? The paper curled slow in the cast iron stove, the ink bleeding into black as the numbers disappeared one edge at a time. $47,000 for 8 years of HOA fees I never agreed to, never signed for, never even knew existed. And the smell of scorched paper mixed with pine smoke hung thick in my cabin like a warning I chose to ignore, right up until the knock came. 3 sharp hits against solid wood that echoed through the quiet like it didn't belong out here, like it had traveled miles just to find me. I didn't rush, didn't panic, just watched the last corner of that bill collapse into ash before I stood up and wiped my hands on denim, boots heavy against the floorboards as I crossed the room. Because when you spend 8 years off-grid, silence teaches you something most people forget. Nothing loud ever brings good news. And when I opened that door, the cold morning air hit first, then the badge. County deputy, mid-40s, tired eyes, holding a folder like it. Weighed more than it should. "Ethan Cole?" he asked, and I nodded, already knowing this wasn't about a misunderstanding. "Sir, I'm here to notify you that a lien has been placed on this property." Lien. The word landed flat, like it expected a reaction I didn't give. By Willow Ridge Estates HOA. There it was, the name printed on that bill I just burned. The same HOA that built their perfect little neighborhood about 2 miles down the ridge while I was busy living off solar panels and rainwater, growing my own food, and minding my own business. They claim unpaid dues totaling $47,000, plus penalties. Penalties? I almost smiled at that, because penalties require agreement, require signatures, require something I never gave. Failure to respond may result in foreclosure proceedings. And that's when the silence changed, not louder, not dramatic, just different. Like the air shifted around something invisible. I took the folder from his hand, felt the cheap weight of paper pretending to be authority, flipped it open right there on the porch, pages of official language, threats dressed up as procedure. Numbers stacked like they meant something, and right at the top, my land, my address, listed under HOA jurisdiction. Except it wasn't. It never was. I looked past the deputy, down the slope where their houses sat in neat rows, matching roofs, trimmed lawns, everything controlled, everything approved, everything exactly the same, and for a second, I could almost see it from their side. Empty land for years, no fences, no lights, no signs of life. Easy to assume nobody cared, easy to assume it was theirs to claim, sir, the deputy said, probably expecting anger, confusion, maybe panic, but I just closed the folder and nodded, calm, steady, because here's the thing about living off-grid for 8 years, you learn to rely on facts, not noise, and something about this didn't add up, not the amount, not the claim, not the way they moved so confidently, like they'd already won. "You planning to respond?" he asked, and I leaned against the doorframe, the wood cool against my shoulder, eyes still on that neighborhood in the distance. "Oh, I'll respond," I said, voice even, almost quiet, just not the way they think, because buried somewhere under their paperwork, under their assumptions, under 8 years of them pretending this land belonged to their little system, there was one detail they missed, one line they never checked, one piece of paper older than every house they built, and when I found it, when I proved it, this wasn't going to be about $47,000 anymore. It was going to be about everything they touched that was never theirs to begin with. I did not wait until the deputy left before opening that folder again. The paper edges still crisp, the ink too clean, like it had been printed by someone who never expected to be questioned, and I could feel it in my hands, that quiet confidence baked into every line. Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, jurisdiction expanded, dues assessed, penalties applied, all written like facts instead of claims. But I have lived too long without systems to confuse authority with truth. I stepped off the porch, boots crunching gravel as the wind moved through the trees, carrying that faint smell of fresh-cut grass from down the ridge, their grass, their rules, their version of order, and I started walking toward the old shed behind my cabin. The one place I kept things that mattered before the world decided to organize everything into neat digital folders. Inside it smelled like dust and oil, metal tools hanging silent on the wall, a wooden chest pushed into the corner where sunlight barely reached. I knelt down and ran my hand across the lid, feeling the grooves my father carved into it. Decades ago, not decorative, just practical, grip lines for when your hands are dirty or wet. I lifted it open and the hinges gave that slow, familiar creak, the kind of sound that reminds you something has been waiting. Inside were stacks of documents wrapped in cloth, yellowed edges, ink that had softened with time but never disappeared. I pulled out the one bundle I had not touched in years, tied with a thin leather strip, and for a moment I just held it, remembering the last time I saw it. My father standing right where I was, telling me something that did not make sense back then. Do not ever sign anything you do not need. And more importantly, know exactly what you already own. I untied the strip and spread the papers across the workbench, the grain of the wood rough under my fingertips. And there it was, the original deed, 1952, long before Willow Ridge was even a thought, before the county carved this land into parcels and sold them like pieces of a puzzle. This was whole land, uninterrupted, and my name was not on that first document. My grandfather's was, but the boundary lines were clear, marked by natural features, the creek to the east, the ridge to the west, the exact ridge those houses now sat behind. I grabbed the HOA documents from the folder and laid them next to the deed, side by side. New ink against old truth, and that was when the first crack showed. Their map used straight lines, clean, efficient, cutting through terrain like it did not matter. But the original survey followed the land itself. Curves, elevation, water flow, things you cannot redraw without consequences. I traced the line with my finger, slow, deliberate, and felt that same shift I had on the porch, something not loud but certain, because if their boundary was wrong, then everything built on that assumption was wrong too. Every fee, every lien, every claim of authority. I leaned back against the workbench, the wood pressing into my spine, and let the silence settle again. Only now it was different, not uncertain, not waiting. It was steady, like a foundation you finally see clearly. They thought 8 years off-grid meant I disappeared, that no one was watching, no one was checking. But the truth is I was right here the whole time, just not playing their game. And now they had stepped onto my land with paperwork that did not match reality. I picked up the deed again, feeling the weight of it, not heavy in ounces but in certainty. And for the first time since that knock, I understood exactly what they had done, not just to me, but to every property line they touched. And that was when I realized this was not a mistake they could quietly fix. This was a pattern, and patterns leave trails, and trails lead somewhere very uncomfortable for people who rely on no one looking too closely. The first time I walked into the Willow Ridge HOA office, it felt like stepping into a different world, one that ran on polished surfaces and quiet assumptions. The air smelled like artificial citrus cleaner and expensive coffee, and every wall was lined with framed certificates that looked official enough to discourage questions. I could hear the faint hum of a printer somewhere in the back, steady and indifferent. Like it had processed 1,000 complaints just like mine. I did not rush to the front desk. I let my boots carry the sound of gravel and dirt into their perfect space, a small detail. But details matter when people are used to control. The receptionist looked up first, her smile practiced, polite, the kind that disappears the second something does not fit the script. "Can I help you?" she asked, and I placed the folder down on the counter, not hard, just enough for the paper inside to shift. "I am here about a lien you filed on my property." Her fingers paused on the keyboard, just for a second, but I saw it, that hesitation when something does not match expectations. She glanced at the screen, typed my name, and then it happened. The look changed, not confusion, not concern, something closer to annoyance, like I had stepped into a process that was already decided. "You will need to speak with the board president," she said, voice tighter now, and before I could respond, I heard heels against tile, sharp, measured, approaching with confidence that filled the room before she did. Linda Harper did not introduce herself. She did not need to. Everything about her said authority, from the tailored jacket to the way she held a folder identical to mine like it was proof of something larger than paper. "Mr. Cole," she said, not asking, stating, her voice smooth but edged. "I was wondering when you would come in." I studied her for a moment, the calm in her posture, the certainty in her tone. This was not new to her. This was routine. "You billed me for 8 years of fees on land I never agreed to include in your association," I said, keeping my voice level, "because volume never wins these conversations, precision does." She smiled, small, Controlled. Your land has been considered part of the Willow Ridge development area since the expansion filing. Expansion filing. I repeated it in my head. The phrase sounded clean, official, like it erased everything that came before it. Show me, I said, and she opened her folder, flipping to a page with a map printed in sharp black lines, the same map I saw in the deputy's folder, straight boundaries cutting across the ridge like someone had drawn them without ever standing on the land itself. This is the recorded plat map approved by the county, she said, tapping the page lightly, and I leaned closer, letting my finger trace the line where my property was supposed to begin, except it did not begin there, not according to anything older than that piece of paper. That line is wrong, I said. Simple, direct. Her smile tightened just enough to notice. The county approved it, she replied. Like approval replaced accuracy, like a stamp made something true. I reached into my own folder and pulled out the original deed, placing it next to her map. The contrast almost quiet but unmistakable. Aged paper against fresh print. Curves against straight lines. This predates your development by decades, I said. And it does not match your boundary. She did not look at it immediately, and that told me more than if she had argued. She knew what she was seeing before she confirmed it. But she kept her posture, kept the control. Older documents are often superseded by updated filings, she said, measured, careful. But there was something under it now. Not doubt, but awareness. Not when the update is wrong, I replied, and for the first time, the room felt different, like the air had shifted just enough to notice. The receptionist stopped typing. The printer hum seemed louder, and Linda Harper finally looked down at the deed, her eyes scanning the lines, the natural boundaries, the creek, the ridge, the exact features that could not be moved with ink. And in that moment, I saw it. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of something cracking. Under the surface, because if my boundary was wrong on their map, then their authority stopped at a line that did not exist, and everything they built beyond it was standing on assumption, not fact. And assumptions do not hold up when someone brings the original paper into the room. She did not argue right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because people like Linda Harper do not pause unless something underneath their certainty shifts, just enough to make them recalibrate. She set her folder down slower this time, aligning it with the edge of the desk like control could be restored through small, precise movements. Mr. Cole, she said, voice still smooth but tighter now. Boundary discrepancies are not uncommon during development. Development transitions, another clean phrase meant to soften something messy. I nodded once, like I understood, even though I knew exactly what she was doing, reframing the problem as routine, manageable, something that would not threaten the structure she represented. Then it should be easy to verify, I replied, tapping the deed lightly with my finger, not aggressive, just enough to keep it present. She glanced toward the back offices, a quick look, almost instinctive, like she was measuring whether this conversation needed witnesses, then back to me. The county records office maintains all official filings, she said. If there is an issue, it will be resolved through proper channels. Proper channels, always the same language, always designed to slow things down, to bury details under process until people give up. But I had spent 8 years without their channels, without their systems. And patience is different when you are not depending on someone else to move. You already filed a lien, I said. That is not a slow process. Her jaw tightened just slightly, and I could see the edge now, not anger, but irritation, like I was not responding the way she expected, like I was supposed to argue or defend, not observe. The lien is a standard enforcement mechanism, she replied, applied when dues remain unpaid. Unpaid dues, I almost smiled again, because that phrase assumed agreement, assumed participation, assumed a contract that did not exist. I slid the deed closer to her, the paper making a soft scraping sound against the polished surface. Show me where I agreed to join your association, I said, and this time she did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the deed again, slower, more deliberate, tracing the natural boundary lines that did not match her map, and I watched her process it. Not the way someone reads something new, but the way someone confirms something they already suspected but hoped would not matter. The receptionist had stopped pretending to work now, her hands resting on the keyboard, eyes fixed just low enough to look busy but not miss anything. The room felt smaller, quieter, like the air was holding its breath. Membership can be implied through development inclusion, Linda said finally, but the words did not land the same. They sounded thinner, less certain, because implied does not hold up the same way signed does. Not on land that was never annexed. I replied, keeping my voice steady, because this was not about winning a moment. This was about letting the truth sit where it could not be ignored. She straightened slightly, regaining posture, pulling authority back around her like a jacket. We will need to review this with our legal team, she said. And there it was, the shift from control to containment, from certainty to delay. But I had expected that. I had counted on it, because review means time, and time means more documents, more records, more chances for the pattern to show itself. I closed my folder slowly, the sound deliberate, final in a way that made the conversation feel less like a request and more like a marker. You should also review every property line in your development, I said, meeting her eyes directly now, not aggressive, just clear, because if this one is wrong, it is not the only one. And for the first time, I saw something real break through her composure, not fear, not fully, but awareness, the kind that spreads fast once it starts. Because this was no longer about one homeowner who lived off-grid and did not pay his dues. This was about a system built on lines that might not exist, and systems like that do not just correct themselves quietly. They unravel, piece by piece. The moment someone proves the first thread was never where it was supposed to be. I did not drive back to the cabin right away. Instead, I turned onto the county road that led to the records office, tires humming against asphalt that felt too smooth after years of gravel. The kind of place where everything is labeled, categorized, filed away like truth can be stored in drawers. The building itself sat low and square, faded brick, an American flag barely moving in the still air. And when I stepped inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees, that recycled air carrying the faint smell of paper and toner, the sound of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, steady, constant, like time moved differently in here, slower, more deliberate. I walked up to the counter and gave my name, not because I expected recognition, but because it was part of the process. And the clerk, an older man with reading glasses resting low on his nose, nodded without looking surprised, like he had seen this kind of request before. Property records? He asked, and I nodded, sliding the deed across the counter. I need everything tied to this parcel, original survey, amendments, expansions, anything filed in the last 10 years. He adjusted his glasses and took the document, eyes scanning the lines with practiced familiarity. And for a moment, I watched him instead of the room. The way his expression stayed neutral, not dismissive, not curious, just focused, like he knew that paper does not lie. People do. Give me a few minutes, he said, disappearing into the back, and I leaned against the counter, the surface cold under my palms, listening to the quiet shuffle of files somewhere beyond the door. And that was when I noticed the map mounted on the wall behind me. A large county layout, lines and sections marked in clean grids, the kind of map that simplifies land into shapes that look easy to control. I stepped closer, eyes scanning until I found the ridge, my ridge, and then Willow Ridge Estates, outlined in bold, recent ink. The boundaries sharp and confident, but even from a distance, something felt off. The lines did not follow the terrain. They cut through it, ignoring the natural curves I had walked my entire life. And that disconnect settled in my chest like confirmation. Not suspicion anymore. Confirmation. The clerk returned with a stack of folders, thicker than I expected, placing them down with a soft thud that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Here you go, he said. Original survey, 1952, plus every recorded modification. Since then, I flipped the first folder open. The original survey matching exactly what I already knew. The creek, the ridge, the boundaries drawn by land, not rulers. Then I moved to the newer filings, and that was where the pattern started to show. One update 10 years ago, labeled boundary clarification. Another 8 years ago, development expansion proposal. Each one shifting the lines just enough to look intentional but not obvious. A few feet here, a few yards there, until the final plat. Map I saw in Linda's office made sense, not as a mistake, but as the end result of small changes stacked over time. I felt the weight of it then, not in anger, but in clarity, because this was not about one wrong line. This was about a series of decisions that slowly moved reality to match convenience. And I could see how easy it would have been. A quiet update approved without much scrutiny. A map adjusted to fit a development plan. A system that trusted its own paperwork more than the ground it described. The clerk watched me for a moment, then said, "You looking for something specific?" And I closed the folder halfway. Meeting his eyes, "I am trying to understand how a boundary moves, without the land moving with it." He nodded slowly, like that answer meant more than the question. "Happens more than people think," he said, "especially when development gets involved." I looked back down at the documents, the lines, the dates, the signatures, and realized something that made the entire situation sharper, more defined. If they shifted my boundary this way, then every property connected to that line shifted with it, which meant this was not just about my land anymore. It was about a chain reaction built into their expansion. And once that kind of pattern is exposed, it does not stay contained. It spreads through every file, every deed, every homeowner who trusted those lines without ever checking what they replaced. I did not leave the records office with just copies. I left with a pattern burned into my head. Dates, signatures, small shifts that looked harmless on their own, but lined up too clean when you stacked them together. I could feel it as I stepped back outside. The sunlight sharper now, the air warmer against my face, like the world had not changed, but I had finally caught up to something it already knew. I sat in my truck for a moment. The folders spread across the passenger seat, edges uneven. Pages slightly curled from years of being handled and forgotten, and I started laying them out in order. Original survey, first adjustment, second adjustment, expansion filing, final plat, each one moving the line just enough to go unnoticed until it became permanent. And that was when the realization settled in fully. They did not just redraw my boundary. They built an entire development on top of a version of the land that only existed on paper. I ran my finger along one of the later maps, tracing the clean straight edge that cut across what I knew was uneven ground, hills, dips, a drainage path that carried water every spring. None of it reflected in that line, because it had never been drawn from the land. It had been drawn for the plan, and plans do not always care about what is already there. I closed the folders slowly and leaned back, the seat creaking under my weight. And for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to think beyond my own property, because if their expansion map was based on these adjusted lines, then every lot sold, every house built, every fee collected was tied to that same foundation, and foundations like that do not crack quietly. They shift everything above them when they move. I drove back toward the ridge, the road curving up through familiar terrain, trees casting long shadows across the asphalt. And as the houses came into view again, neat rows, identical spacing, everything controlled, I saw them differently now, not as a neighborhood, but as a result, a physical outcome of decisions made in offices like the one I just left, decisions that assumed no one would ever walk the land and compare it to the paper. I pulled over at the edge of the development, engine idling low, and stepped out, boots hitting the ground with that same steady rhythm, the air carrying the faint scent of cut grass and irrigation. A man watering his lawn glanced at me briefly before looking away, not interested, not concerned, just another resident in a system that worked for him. And I could not blame him for that, because when something looks stable, people trust it. They do not question the lines beneath their feet. I walked a few steps closer to the boundary marker, a metal stake driven into the ground, bright tape tied around it, marking what the HOA considered the edge, and I crouched down, brushing dirt away with my hand, revealing the stamp numbers, coordinates that matched the newer filings, not the original survey. And that small detail confirmed everything. The shift was not accidental. It had been measured, recorded, approved, and reinforced until it became the accepted truth. I stood back up slowly, looking out over the houses again, windows reflecting sunlight, roofs aligned perfectly, everything built on confidence in those lines, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle in my chest. Not anger, not urgency, just clarity. Because this was no longer about proving my land was outside their reach. That part was already clear. This was about showing that their reach extended further than it should have, into places they never had the right to touch. And the moment that became visible, the moment it was documented and undeniable, this entire structure they relied on would have to answer for it. Not just to me, but to every name tied to those files, every signature placed on a map that did not match the ground it claimed to define. I did not go back to the cabin to rest. I went back to plan, because once you see a pattern like that, you do not react. You position yourself. I spread every document across my table, the wood still carrying faint scratches from years of use, and I arranged them in a line that told the story without needing explanation. Original survey, first adjustment, second adjustment, expansion filing, final plat, each one shifting reality a little further away from truth, and I started marking them, not with emotion, but with precision, dates circled, signatures noted, distances compared down to the foot, because details are what hold up when everything else falls apart. I pulled out my old field notebook, the one I used to track water levels and solar output, and began writing down the exact differences between what the land is and what their map claims it to be. Creek position off by 12 feet, ridge slope ignored entirely, drainage path cut through like it never existed, small things. Individually, but together they built something undeniable. I could hear the wind outside pushing through the trees, steady, consistent, the same way it had for years without asking permission. And it reminded me why I stayed off-grid in the first place. Because systems like theirs depend on people not checking, not questioning, just accepting what is printed in front of them. But paper only works when no one brings it back to the ground. And that was exactly what I was about to do. I drove out again just before sunset, the light low and sharp, casting long shadows that made the terrain easier to read. I walked the boundary line slowly, step by step, matching the original deed against the actual land, stopping at each natural marker, the bend in the creek, the rise in the ridge, the cluster of old trees that had been there longer than any document. And I documented everything, photos, measurements, angles, nothing rushed, nothing guessed, because this was not about proving a point. It was about building something they could not dismiss. I even brought out an old surveying tape, stretching it across sections where their map claimed straight lines, watching it dip and rise with the land in ways their version never accounted for. And every measurement confirmed the same thing. Their boundary did not exist out here. It only existed in their files. And that gap between paper and reality was where everything would break. I returned to the truck as the sky turned darker, the air cooling fast, and sat there reviewing what I had collected, not with satisfaction, but with focus, because this was only the beginning. Proving my land was outside their control was simple now, but exposing how far their control had spread beyond that would take something more, something official, something that forced their entire system to be examined. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the county contacts, stopping at one name I had not needed in years, the Regional Land Survey Supervisor, a position most people do not think about until something goes wrong. And I knew this qualified. I did not call right away. I waited, thinking through the sequence, because timing matters as much as evidence. They needed to believe they still had control. They needed to continue acting on those lines, issuing fees, enforcing rules, reinforcing their own mistake. Because the more they built on it, the harder the fall would be. When it was finally challenged, I leaned back in the seat, the faint smell of dust and paper filling the cab, and looked out toward the neighborhood again, lights coming on one by one, each house glowing with quiet certainty, unaware of the foundation beneath them shifting into something else entirely. And I realized something then, something simple but absolute. They thought this was about collecting $47,000 from one homeowner who lived off the grid, but they had already turned it into something much bigger, something that would not be settled with a bill or a conversation, something that would force every line they drew to be measured against the only thing that actually matters, the land itself. I made the call early the next morning, before the sun fully cleared the ridge, because timing matters when you are about to disrupt something that believes it is stable. The line rang twice before a voice answered, steady, professional, the kind of voice that deals in facts instead of opinions. I introduced myself, kept it simple, and told him I had documentation that showed a boundary discrepancy tied to a recent development expansion. There was a pause, not long, but enough to register. Interest, send me what you have, he said, and I told him I would do better than that. I would walk him through it on the ground, because paper can be argued, but land cannot. He agreed to meet that afternoon, and when I hung up, I felt that shift again, not excitement, not nerves, just alignment. like everything was moving exactly where it needed to go. I spent the next few hours organizing everything. Copies of the original deed, the sequence of adjusted filings, photos from the field, measurements written clearly, nothing exaggerated, nothing assumed, just facts laid out in a way that could not be ignored. By the time his truck pulled up near the boundary marker, the sun was high and the air carried that dry heat that settles over the ridge by midday. He stepped out with a clipboard in hand. I was already scanning the terrain before he even greeted me. "Show me," he said, and I did not start with the paperwork. I started with the land, walking him along the actual boundary, pointing out the creek, the natural slope, the drainage path that cut through the area every spring. He crouched down at one point, running his hand along the ground where their map claimed a straight line, and I could see it in his posture, the same recognition I had the day before. This did not match, not even close. We went back to the truck and I laid the documents out across the hood, the metal warm under the paper, and walked him through each filing, each adjustment, each small shift that built toward the final map the HOA was using. He did not interrupt, did not question, just listened, flipping pages, comparing lines, occasionally glancing back at the land like he was aligning two versions of the same story. "These adjustments," he said finally, tapping one of the later filings. "They were approved without a full resurvey." I nodded, because that was exactly the problem. Approval without verification, paper without ground. And the final plat, he continued, was based on those adjusted lines. He looked back toward the houses, the rows of roofs visible over the ridge, and then back down at the documents. And I could see the weight of it settling in, not just as a mistake, but as a chain of decisions that led somewhere much larger. "You understand what this means," he said, and I met his eyes, steady. "It means the boundary they are enforcing does not exist out here." He nodded slowly, then closed the folder, the sound firm, decisive. "I am going to have to file a formal review," he said, and there it was, the moment everything shifted from private dispute to official process. Not their process, not the HOA's controlled system, but one that looked at the entire structure, not just the surface. He made a few notes, took photos of his own, measurements to confirm what I had already documented, and before he left, he paused, looking out over the development again. "If this holds," he said, "this does not just affect you." I did not answer right away, because we both already knew that every house, every lot, every fee tied to those lines would be pulled into that review, every assumption tested against reality. He got back into his truck and drove off, leaving a trail of dust that settled slowly behind him, and I stood there for a moment, the quiet returning, but it felt different now, not empty, not waiting, but moving, because somewhere, between the paper and the land, a line had been crossed, not by me, not yesterday, but years ago when someone decided the map mattered more than the ground, and now that line was about to be measured the only way that matters, against something that does not shift just because it is easier on paper. The notice did not arrive with noise or urgency. It came folded in a plain envelope 3 days later, left in my mailbox like any other piece of mail. But the weight of it felt different the moment I picked it up, not heavier in ounces, heavier in consequence. I carried it back to the cabin without rushing, set it on the table, and let the quiet sit for a moment before opening it. Because some things change the moment you read them, and there is value in knowing that moment is coming. The paper inside was official, county seal at the top, language precise, measured, the kind that does not exaggerate because it does not need to, formal review initiated, boundary verification in progress, enforcement action suspended pending investigation. I read it once, then again, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to feel exactly what it meant, the lien, the fees, the pressure they tried to apply. All of it paused, not dismissed yet, but held in place while something larger moved around it. I stepped outside with the paper still in my hand, the air cool, the trees shifting slightly in the wind, and looked out toward the ridge where the houses sat. Everything still looked the same from a distance, clean lines, quiet streets. Nothing about it suggested anything was wrong. And that was the point. Systems like that do not show cracks until someone forces them into the open. I spent the next few days watching without interfering. Trucks came and went. Lawns were cut. Lights turned on at the same time every evening. Routine held steady. But under that surface, things were already shifting. I saw it in small details first. A survey crew at the edge of the development one morning, orange vests moving slowly along the boundary, placing markers, measuring, comparing, not relying on the existing stakes, but checking against something deeper. I saw it again when a notice appeared on the community board near the entrance, residents gathering around it, reading, talking in low voices, not loud, not chaotic, just uncertain, the kind of uncertainty that spreads when something familiar stops making sense. A week later, another letter arrived, this one thicker, more direct. Findings confirmed discrepancies between recorded plat and original survey. Further investigation required. Potential impact on multiple parcels. The language stayed careful, but the meaning was clear. This was no longer contained. I drove down to the edge of the development that afternoon, parked where I could see the entrance, and watched as a few homeowners stood near the board, papers in hand, comparing notes, asking questions that did not have easy answers. And for a moment, I felt something close to sympathy, because they had trusted those lines, built their lives around them, and now those lines were being questioned, not by opinion, but by the land itself. I did not approach them, did not explain, because this was not my role to manage. This was the result of a system correcting itself under pressure. I turned the truck back toward the cabin as the sun started to drop, casting long shadows across the ridge, and by the time I reached my place, the light had softened, the same way it always did, unchanged by any of this. I placed the letters on the table next to the original deed, old paper beside new, and the contrast felt final in a way I could not ignore. They had built authority on something that looked correct, something that passed through enough hands to become accepted. But acceptance does not make something true, and truth does not need to be loud to matter. It just needs to be consistent. I stepped outside one last time that evening, the sky turning deep blue, the first stars just starting to show, and the ridge stood there the way it always had, unmoved, unadjusted, exactly where it belonged. And that was the part they never accounted for. You can redraw a line on paper as many times as you want. You can file it, approve it, enforce it, but the land does not follow those changes. It waits, patient, until someone decides to measure it again. And when they do, everything that was built on the wrong line has to answer for it. Not through argument, not through force, but through the simple fact that reality does not shift to match a document, no matter how official it looks.